also having complaints made about me by members of the public, mostly for some reason academics. I don't know why, but some of these academics were furious that a young brown fellow was on the internet saying that the government was making illegal public health orders. They were really angry and making complaints to the Law Society and to my employer. So my employer didn't like that either. And there was this accusation of going around that I was bringing the public service into disrepute. And I was like, hang on, that was an alarm bell moment for me, because I thought, hang on, the public service, I'm literally trying to serve the public. So I started to get a bit annoyed, and a little thing was going on inside me where I began to realize, shit, I'm going to have to leave. But I stayed for a couple more months.
Hey guys, and welcome back to the channel. Today, I have a very exciting guest for you. Today, I get to interview Peter Phan. Peter Phan is a human rights lawyer and the founder of Maat's Method, a legal practice he founded during the pandemic focused on human rights. Now, Peter comes from very humble beginnings, and Peter eventually worked at Legal Aid, where he got into a little bit of hot water with some of the comments that he was putting out regarding health orders. Now, that eventually led to Peter starting his own legal practice, but we discuss his whole story about what it was like during that period. Like always, if you find this content interesting, like, subscribe, leave a comment, and let me know who you want to see next. First of all, welcome Peter to the Theatre Career Podcast. The intention of this podcast is basically to give kids and people coming up in their career an insight on what it's like to progress in someone's career, what it's like to set up a business, what it's like to face challenges, and what it's like effectively to overcome those challenges. So I always start off with all my guests just to give us a little bit of background about yourself. Tell us a little bit about where you studied, what you studied, and what those first couple of years in high school were like, and what those first couple of years in university were like.
So I was born in Blacktown in Western Sydney and grew up in Penrith and St. Mary's. Pretty sort of typical. We didn't have much. My parents worked extremely hard and did their best. Both had various forms of disability, struggled to assimilate. So I went to schools that were just sort of average schools in Western Sydney. In high school, I didn't do particularly well until the last couple of years of high school, and in year 12 especially, for some reason, I was really doing as well as I could in the HSC, and kind of by chance put in place particular strategies that helped me to do the best that I could do, and they worked, and I just guessed them, but it was things like time blocking and particular types of to-do lists, and by total chance, seemingly they worked. And combined with the choice they give you in year 12 to sort of pick whatever subjects you want and are good at, it meant that I just did way, way better in the HSC than I was expecting, anyone was expecting anywhere around me. And that gave me the choice to be able to do anything I wanted to do. And being a really naive 17-year-old kid who had no idea what he wanted to do, didn't know himself at all, but knew that he liked communicating and knew that he wanted to help people. I chose to study law and journalism, and I went to Sydney Uni and studied law and journalism there. Really struggled to engage with, enjoy, and perform well in the degree of university. I was very avoidant of study. I found lots of ways to escape doing my best in that course, and kind of just scraped through and formed this, because I wasn't enjoying it, and I formed this pretty unhealthy relationship during that 6-year degree with the law and with law, and decided that I didn't want to be a lawyer because the people around me in law school were very different to me. They looked very different to me. They had very different values to me. They spoke differently to me. They came from different families to me, and I just didn't feel like I fit in. I also didn't feel like I cared about what everyone around me cared about. And I was also becoming very disillusioned with society as a whole, and the sort of robotic corporate malaise that the people around me seemed to be voluntarily walking into. So I didn't do law for a few years. I worked as a social worker. I also did music for a while. I tried to do that full time. My girlfriend at the time, now wife, financially supported me to her credit. Um, and after those experiences and lots of self growth and so on, I thought maybe there was something in that 6 year degree I did. And maybe if I at least try being a lawyer, I might find a way to fit who I was into that role. And I didn't know how I was going to do it yet, but I just decided to give it a go. Um, I got a job initially because I really wanted to be a human rights lawyer. I had studied human rights law at uni, and like almost every kid in law school wants to do human rights law, at least at some stage. And then somehow they end up being corporate lawyers. But at some stage, every lawyer wanted to be a human rights lawyer. And I always had that dream. Yeah, please
Yeah, can
do.
I just chime in on that? Is that the classic analogy at university? When you're in your 20s, you're very, if you don't have, what's that saying? If you're not left wing in your
Yeah,
20s, you don't have a heart, and if you're not right wing in your 30s, you don't have a brain.
yeah,
It's that classic. Everybody wants to be that human rights lawyer, wants to save the world. They're gonna, everyone's quite angry at the world, and they want to do something positive
dude.
at that young age.
I started a charity in university called Fix the World. How's that for a naive young attempt? Anyway, go on. Yeah,
No, I was going to say that's a classic. Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you there. Continue on. But that seems like the classic story that everybody kind of goes through in those younger days. And the fact that you went out and started a charity as well. And again, it kind of makes sense as well from the background that you came through as well, where you kind of struggled a little bit in high school, struggled a little bit in the first couple of years of university as well. Didn't find that real connection towards what you were kind of doing.
yeah, man. Well, that's right. Anyway, when I did go into law, I began work as I was working with victims of in private practice with victims of historical abuse, so sexual abuse, physical abuse, psychiatric abuse, mostly institutional abuse. Um, as in people when they were kids were abused and now they're adults and they're suing the government or a religious institution for the abuse that they suffered, which in Australia, I was shocked to discover how rampant that stuff is. It's pretty disgusting. But anyway, it was really heavy work, and it was sort of along the lines of the human rights angle I wanted to go for, but it was very, very niche, and
Yeah,
I wanted to expand my horizons a bit, and I wanted to learn more. So I got offered a job in a firm in the city, like a sort of pretty, like a large corporate law firm in the city, in their civil litigation team, and decided that I knew that I didn't want to be a corporate lawyer in the city, um, what I saw as a corporate lawyer in the city, but I had a feeling that I would learn a lot if I did that for a while and see what that world was like in case I was ever up against that world, which is what I thought might happen in the future. So I went and did that, and actually, to be honest, found it extremely difficult. I became extremely depressed. Um, when I say I found it difficult, I was good at the work and performing well, and I was on this like fast track to promotion and success. But I inside was deeply unhappy and unsatisfied. I did not feel like I was living in a way that was aligned with who I was or my values. I became extremely depressed because I thought I was trapped in that world. I almost forgot that I had the ability to alter and change things. I thought, Jesus, is this what being a lawyer is like? Holy crap, I can't do this. I'm not going to make it. And probably, to be honest, I left at a good time. In this, I maybe would have benefited if I stayed for a bit longer to learn some more skills. I learned a lot in that job, I have to tell you, and to I don't regret taking it. I learned how to practice civil litigation, which now I am so reliant on. Every little nugget I learned in that job, because I wasn't in it for too long, but even every little nugget that I got, I've now just relied on to the extent of tenfold of what I actually learned. So very valuable in that sense,
Can,
but very difficult. Yeah.
that experience that you had that was extremely sort of difficult. That's a classic sort of experience that most graduates sort of finish university will experience. They're kind of straight out of university, don't really connect with the work that they're doing. What you think the work that you're going to be doing is very different in the real world to what you're actually doing. Um, However, do you think that was a growth stage in your career, specifically going through that period of time? How long were you in that role for?
It was about a year. It wasn't very long. Yeah.
I was going to say, and the learnings that you got from that experience. What sort of, in terms of the advice to people going through an experience like that, what kind of strategies did you kind of develop to kind of get through that year of that hard year of work? Even though you're developing well, you're excelling at everything, but it's just your heart and soul's not into that.
That's a complicated question. At the time, um, what I was doing to get through it was um, the best thing I was doing was exercising regularly because I was so deeply unhappy, unfulfilled, stressed. That was kind of, I used to say to my colleagues, I remember, it's like, I'll be pretty transparent with them. I told them, it's like I'm riding a bicycle on top of a ridge line and the ridge line keeps moving. And if I stop exercising, I'm going to fall off the edge. So I told them I have to do my exercise in the mornings before work. Anyway, but I was not. So it's funny. The advice I would give to myself or to a kid or a young adult in those shoes is actually to stick it out until you don't feel like you're learning anymore, or the um, the lack of fulfillment or the unhappiness is becoming quite overwhelming. And you'll know when that is. And it's not worth going through serious physical, spiritual, psychiatric trauma for the sake of pushing through something. But it's extremely beneficial to be uncomfortable. And the amount that I learned in that period of time was absolutely astronomical. And actually, if I had better strategies in place for if I had a bit more knowledge, a bit more life experience, if I was doing it now, I think I would have probably stayed for 2 to 3 years rather than 1 year. But I didn't know how to. And for me, the amount of depression was actually becoming crippling. And I got the opportunity to actually pivot and work as a human rights lawyer. So it was kind of like, oh, okay, awesome. Here's the break I've been looking for. And I was suddenly emboldened and excited about being a lawyer for the first time in my career. Um, and I've been a lawyer for maybe 3 or 4 years at that stage. So, um, what advice would I give? Just make sure that you're not just escaping from difficulty and discomfort, because difficulty and discomfort is extremely beneficial, and it's the only way we grow. And it sucks, but on the other side, you become a more full, well realized version of yourself, which is a pretty amazing thing. We need discomfort and difficulty. It's why we're here. The Buddhists say life is suffering. They're pretty wise. It's an essential element of our life here.
It's very interesting. So there's a couple. There's a bit out of that. So if we could just wind that back a little bit, I think there's a couple key learnings there. I think one of those is, and I'm a big supporter of this. You said you exercised every morning before you got into work. I think there is something magical about exercise. Was that just cardio training, or were you lifting weights? Or
A bit of both, but at that time I was really enjoying like high intensity interval training. So there was a gym
right,
near to where I lived. I get up at 4:30 in the morning, and I have a 5 a.m. high interval training class, and it's a mix of like weights and resistance, but also it's pretty high intensity cardio. And it literally kept me going in terms of my mental health, my obviously my physical health, but for my mental health, it was extremely important.
And I'll give you an anecdote to that as well. A couple of years ago, myself, I started training and doing all that sort of stuff after returning from a holiday and coming back quite fat, let's be honest. Um, However, interesting enough, those I developed that habit of going to the gym every single morning, and that habit actually, I think, was a difference for myself personally between during the COVID lockdowns specifically. What kept me sane, I was able to procure some gym equipment just prior to everything going through the roof in terms of price, but that habit that I formed of exercise, um, I think was able to keep me sane during the 2.5 years of the lockdowns that we faced here in Melbourne. Now, I'm not saying everyone should exercise. By all means, go and speak to your medical professionals, but and all of that. But I think there is a real magic to doing some exercise prior to work. I think strategies like that actually help alleviate some of the anxiety that people feel. And depending on which psychologist you speak to as well, a lot of anxiety is actually just tension in the body as well. So being able to actually release some of that energy, doing some exercise, is a great way to sort of manage through those really stressful periods.
We're not supposed to be sedentary and sit still all day. It's extremely bad for us. In an informal sense of this word, it disables us. And incorporating movement into our day, for me, yes, I agree. I like doing it in the morning as well. Otherwise, I might not do it. I get caught up in other stuff. But I get it out of the way in the morning. Means I perform much better during the day as well. Much better. The days that I go for a run in the morning,
Correct.
if I've got a meeting, I'll perform twice as well as if I hadn't gone for that run. Because as you say, you say anxiety gets stuck in the body. I think it just moves everything. I think it allows us to operate in a much more sort of flow state than if we're sort of stagnant and stuck and tired and stiff. All of that translates in terms of our intellectual capacity as well.
And just an anecdote for anyone who does suffer some anxiety. I personally have suffered anxiety my entire whole life as well. And sometimes even if I've got important meetings that are coming up, you get a little bit anxious before that. If I go for a run, like you were saying, prior to a meeting like that or something, that anxiety level does drop, and it does give you that sort of that little bit of confidence to sort of get through that part of the meeting. The other thing that you actually mentioned as well, and again, this comes with maturity. It's something that we all learn as we grow as well. You know, in that first role that you had where it was quite tough, with the benefit of hindsight, you'd probably stay there a little bit longer. I've had experiences like that myself, where personally I've worked in places where it was just too stressful and I left because of the stressful period of time. And then, with the benefit of hindsight, you do go back and learn. I think your message there was that, growth is obtained through, painful experiences like that. By all means, don't hang around in a job where you're getting bullied. That is absolutely, I think, completely unacceptable. However, if you are in one of those roles where the environment is sort of, it's not a bullying environment, but there is that ability to sort of grow through some painful experiences, expand on things, learn new things, something where you may not be necessarily comfortable. Those are great opportunities that I think they do present to people, and try and stick them out for as long as you can without, as you were saying, completely going insane in the process.
Yeah, I think that's a good encapsulation.
Perfect. And now on that, so you were there for about a year. You've gone through this sort of very tough process of learning how to sort of cope in that environment, and then how did the human rights lawyer opportunity sort of present itself? Is it something that you applied for, or was it you were headhunted through through a platform or somewhere or through a connection?
I had previously made some kind of expression of interest with. So there's in legal aid, which is a government-funded legal service in New South Wales for people who can't afford
Yep.
regular legal help. They have a So first of all, a lot of people don't know they have a whole civil litigation arm. It's not just criminal lawyers. Inside the civil litigation arm, there's a bunch of specialist teams,
Right.
and there's a human rights specialist team in the legal aid civil team, which is quite incredible as a lawyer because there's not that many actual human rights legal roles going. There's a very small amount, and that's because human rights is a bit of an amorphous title, but it generally refers to particular areas of law that don't have any money in them. So it's not like there's any private law firms that operate human rights legal practices because they go bankrupt. Um, so there's
Pretty much, yeah.
a few government-funded legal services that are human rights focused. There's probably 3 or 4, and they actually all rely on government funding, which I can talk about later, but that poses some problems because usually if somebody's breaching human rights, it's the government. So there's a little bit of there can be barriers in what you're allowed to do and what you're not allowed to do. You look perplexed.
I have no idea what you're talking about when you say that governments breach human rights. I've never heard of such allegations in my entire life. I am,
Well,
you know, a couple of years ago, the government allowed me to stay in my house for 22 hours a day and allowed me 2 hours of exercise a day and a 5K radius. Now, if that's not human rights, I'm not entirely sure what human rights are. But we'll definitely get into that in the second half of the interview.
Yeah. So to go back to your question, I had put in an expression of interest with this human rights legal team, not thinking anything would come of it. The first role that I had was a human rights legal role, but was so niche, and therefore I didn't think I would get in. But I was surprised one day that the manager of the team called me, and I think I had some kind of panel interview, and I don't know, I did well in the interview. I think I was as honest as I could be about who I was and why I wanted the role and what I did and didn't have, and I think they appreciated it. And actually, I didn't get the role first. I just remembered I had an interview and didn't get the role. But I was very close enough that they called me and said I was the best external candidate, but there was an internal candidate that got the job because in government there's a lot of people on temporary contracts, and sometimes a lot of the time they'll get the permanent role when they come up. Went back to the corporate job for I think another couple of months, and then I got a call saying, "Hey, a position's open. We really like you. Do you want it?" And I took it. It was like super short term at first. It was a rolling contract. I think it was like 6 weeks. But I so badly wanted to be a human rights lawyer that I decided to take the risk and take it. And that kept getting extended, and I ended up staying there for a few years until in the human rights specialist team until COVID rolled around.
And there's a key lesson in that as well. So the old saying, when one door shuts, another door opens. That's really interesting that you were saying that you went for the interview, and don't necessarily be disheartened because this happens to a lot of people in their careers as well. Go to an interview, you don't necessarily get the role that you apply for. However, you should always interview well and always prepare for an interview and do the best that you can in an interview. And the reason for that is that if you do stand out in an interview, when a new role comes up, they will definitely just call you back, and you might not even have to interview for that role. You might just be offered that role. That's happened to me multiple times, and it's happened to a lot of people that have effectively. It's happened to a lot of people that I know who have gone for roles that they wanted, never got the role, but then they get called back 3, 6, 12 months later for a new position that opens up. So that's a very interesting lesson. And on that as well, and this is another thing that you were saying as well, that first role was only 6 weeks, right? It was only a 6-week contract to start off with. So you've got a full-time job that kind of pays the bills. You don't get paid much as a first year or a first year law student. It's contrary to belief on a lot of those things. But you've got a full-time job. Everyone's But you did take a bit of a leap, taking a sort of a, you wanted to become a human rights lawyer to pursue your dream a little bit, but you did take a bit of a risk taking just a 6 week role effectively.
Yeah, I remember it was a little scary, but two things helped. One was I hated my current job so much that it was probably easier to take the leap. But secondly, I knew in my heart that that was the pathway I wanted to take. And the only way I was going to get closer to that dream was if I actually took a significant step in that direction. And this door had opened up, and I'm sort of a bit of a fatalist in the sense that I think things happen for a reason, and there was no way I wasn't going to step through that door.
Absolutely, and this is it's a key thing that I tell people as well. I think in life, I'm a big fan. Something you just said as well, a fatalist. I think everything is kind of determined in fate a little bit. And I think everything you want in life will present to you at some point in time, as long as you're persistent to go out for that opportunity will arise. The key, and I think this is where a lot of people fall down, is when that opportunity does arise, are you ready to, pull the trigger and actually take that opportunity? Because it may not be in the exact form that you are kind of wanting. Like you were just mentioning as well, you're a little bit, concerned. It's only a 6 week role. You've got a full-time job. What happens if, it doesn't continue? But I think people have to be prepared to sort of take that leap of faith when those opportunities do present.
Yeah, I agree. Risk, yeah. I mean, people have different tolerances for risk, and I don't know what the right answer is, but I've always had quite a high tolerance for risk when it comes to, I guess, security, personal circumstance, which is part of the reason why I can operate as human rights lawyer. But
I was going to say,
yeah, yeah,
it's not the most in law. Is human rights the most lucrative avenue that you can head down?
Not if you don't get any government funding. So, yeah, no, it's not. It's not.
And it goes. I think it goes back into the DNA of everything that you were saying as well. In terms of you started, you worked in social work. You wanted to, connections with people. You wanted to help people out, and it sort of, you know, goes with the way that you sort of, manifest yourself and the way that you want to do things. Now, that first 6 weeks, what part of human rights were you actually in when you first got into that sort of that legal aid side of doing human rights?
Yeah, so that team does a few different things. One thing they do a lot of is claims against um, government institutions such as the police or corrective services for things like false imprisonment or malicious prosecution when people's liberty is taken from them without lawful grounds. There's also privacy law, discrimination law, um, administrative law, which is challenging the legality of government decisions. So it's pretty broad um, sort of caseload of various quote unquote human rights legal areas, but they are actually areas of human rights law. There's a little bit of there was a little bit of international law as well that comes into it because a lot of the human rights influence statutes like the discrimination statutes in each state and territory and federally, they refer to the international treaties and covenants because they have to because they are influenced by the rights that are supposed to be protected in those treaties and covenants. So there's international law woven into it as well. So there's actually a pretty good broad human rights practice where there was exposure to all kinds of work, and I did get exposure to many different types of work very early because being legal aid, although they obviously are government funded, they don't get that much funding, and things are run on a bit of a tight budget. So as soon as you're in there, you're thrust into running, a full caseload of matters, and you kind of figure it out yourself as you go along.
Absolutely, and I think that it's interesting that you say that, and the fact that you run your own business right now as well. That being thrown into the sort of the deep end and trying to having to sort of learn everything on the fly and sort of innovate and kind of do everything yourself because you're not obviously funded. You are government funded, but it's not necessarily it's there's not a lot of funding out there to do that. I think that those sort of skill sets that you learned, do you think they kind of helped you later on in your the way that you run your own business now as well?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. The ability to, well, just getting used to figuring things out for yourself, and also understanding that a lot of the fears, well, I'll speak for myself, a lot of the fears I have had and still have about doing things that I'm not ready to do, or whatever. A lot of those fears are just like once you start doing things, they generally tend to be easier and more manageable and more doable than your fears or my fears expected it to be. So that was a really important lesson. And I will say, in fairness, I did have a really good supervisor there who was very hands-on, helping to support me as I went along and learned all these things very quickly. But yes, having to pick up and play it was a good character development.
Absolutely, and it's interesting that you that what you mentioned just there. Every time you try something new, the fear of being able to do that it is quite high. The fact that you don't know how to do it, but when you sort of start, whatever starting means, as long as you can start down that path, like you will always figure out a solution on how to do something. And if the I think a mastery in someone's career is being able to start quickly, and sort of even fail quickly as well, but start quickly, without just that hesitation before you sort of jump in. The quicker you can jump in and sort of learn something, the faster you will come to that solution. And yes, the fears are always there. Every time you start something new, that fear of unknowing, that imposter syndrome, as we've always heard it, is there. But as long as you just get the ball rolling, get something going, I think that's a critical thing. While you were at Legal Aid, was that eye opening in terms of some of the sort of, should I say, human rights abuses that we've witnessed, or just some of the issues that were raised to you? Did you think that some of those issues were without talking to a specific case or anything, but did you think in a country like Australia those issues would arise?
I like an environment where a lot of the issues that translated into the kinds of cases I see at Legal Aid were not far away from my personal experience in life. So I wasn't surprised
Right.
or shocked by what was coming through the door. I already knew I was already heavily disillusioned by society and the systems that make it up by that point in time. And to be honest, I don't think I had much of that. I was more shocked when I was doing institutional abuse work by the sheer volume of abuse that has occurred, in sexual and psychological abuse that has occurred to hundreds of thousands of children in Australia um, over the past couple of hundred years. But that was when I was much younger then, so I was kind of, and that was, I guess, something I just didn't know that much about. But yeah, by the time I got to Legal Aid, I was just, I think I was already pretty disillusioned. And I also had
Right.
kind of experienced a lot of this stuff. I knew the clients, like I was like, I know this guy.
Right, that's interesting. Just back on that whole that institutional, that abuse thing, that was happening at scale in front of our eyes, and nothing happened about it. And how long did it take for an inquiry for something like that to take? Was it 30 years, 30, 40 years?
Oh, way longer than that. I mean,
Yeah,
there was a Royal Commission into institutional sexual abuse in 2015, I think it was, which was really the
yeah.
first major nationwide acknowledgement that it has occurred to the scale that it has. And there's been, I mean, it depends how far back you want to go, but there has been documented consistent institutional sexual abuse in this country since settlement, which
Right.
is disgusting,
That's
but
200 years ago.
it's the
Yeah.
truth. Yeah, it's the truth.
That's That's really interesting, and I guess it's a learning lesson for anyone who says, you know, trust the government or trust big corporations.
Good way to
Uh,
become disillusioned with, uh, say, the government, because what kind of organization allows for, facilitates, and then pretends to ignore within, it, within its walls? To me, it's very difficult for me to align myself in any way with something that is capable of that, because that's not who we are as human beings. That's something.
is there a level of apathy within the community about things like that as well, in the sense that they kind of know it happens, but they don't want to confront something that's so horrific, and it sort of gets pushed under the rug and doesn't become coming to the public eye for many, many, many years? Or
Definitely.
or is the public just completely unaware?
I think it's a combination of those two things, plus a I mean, apathy is a good word, because I think for the most part, by now, people are pretty well aware of the major depravities that exist around them. Um, but there's a tendency, for some reason, for people to avoid difficult conversations, avoid looking at uncomfortable things, um, try to maintain a life that's as comfortable as possible. Mind you, life's pretty hard, so I'm not slamming people, but there's a lot of misdirection, distraction, and um, kind of people are sort of, I think, diluted by the lives they feel like they have to live, such that they don't have any capacity to consider anything as difficult or challenging or onerous or energy draining as that, unless they have to. I think that's kind of a part of what's going on there.
Absolutely, and I think in addition to that as well, the way that society's kind of structured in such a way as well that um, people are busy. They're you know not they're busy. They're living a hard life, but there's also, like you were mentioning just then as well, there's a lot of distraction that can easily sort of push you away from looking at that issue. Um, and something you just mentioned as well, it's really hard for people to have those open, honest conversations. One of the things I've noticed personally as well is that we've kind of all moved on from COVID. After that whole incident, and there hasn't been necessarily a big emphasis on reviewing what we did, whether it was right or wrong, and trying to get some learnings for if something like that happens again. So what did we do right, what did we do wrong, and I just see that there's no real emphasis on doing something like that, and I think the community sort of has kind of moved on from that issue as well, without having that ability to have those honest conversations to sort of review that, so we sort of learn from our mistakes as well.
Um, yes, whether the community has moved on past COVID depends on how we characterize COVID. So I don't. I think it's useful to view COVID within a wider context. I was lucky enough to come into COVID already skeptical of many of the systems that are, in my opinion, corrupted and allowed COVID to happen. So that meant that when certain things began to happen or were framed in a particular way, I already had my own critical perspective on those things. And that led to me questioning things very early on. To give you an example, I already knew that the pharmaceutical industry is completely corrupt and funds governments around the world to the tune of more than 90% of their various pharmaceutical departments' budget. I already knew that um, most pharmaceutical products are not properly tested in placebo blind controlled trials in the way that most medical standards say they should be. Um, I um, I knew about collusion between particular governments in relation to people like Julian Assange, for example, in flagrant disregard of the various international treaties and covenants around the world. So I knew governments don't care about the international human rights treaties. All of that stuff already existed before COVID. People's human rights, I like to say I was a human rights lawyer before COVID because human rights were being breached way before COVID. Um, it's just that during COVID, it affected the majority of the population, whereas prior to that, it had only affected a minority of the population. So now during COVID, we all got to feel what it's like to have your basic human rights disregarded or diluted or taken away from you. In terms of people moving on past COVID, I don't think it's actually going to be possible to move on in the sense of forgetting it and pretending it didn't happen and living a life that you perceive to be normal or back to normal. I don't think that's going to be possible because, um, well, there's lots of reasons, but one reason is that if we forget about COVID and we think about the form of control that was instituted by governments in Australia and around the world, that kind of thing is a progression that is ongoing and which we're all going to have to face as it manifests in various different forms moving forward. A lot of it already is, but people don't realize it. There's a bill that the federal government in Australia is currently trying to pass, which will literally allow the government to create rules that are enforceable by law to govern what information is allowed to be on the internet. Like, if that's not a continuation of the same themes of authoritarianism that we saw creep up in most Western democracies during COVID, I don't know what is. So that's going to affect people. Like, if they don't think about that now, and if it does pass, when it hits, everybody's suddenly going to realize, oh, wow, we don't really have control of the internet anymore. And then people are once again going to have to make a choice about whether they stand up and take action for what they believe in or if they compromise. And I think a lot of people felt what compromising feels like during the pandemic, and some of the people that did might not do so again so easily, at least a lot of the people I talked to. So,
Absolutely, and absolutely, and just a couple of things on that. That legislation, I'm quite fond, not fond of it. I'm quite aware of that legislation, and we'll actually put a link at the bottom. That legislation, from my understanding, is actually open to for submissions right now. And I would encourage everyone to have a look at that legislation. Have a think about what kind of future they want to live in themselves specifically. And if that legislation goes against your values, please put in a submission or write to your local minister regarding that legislation. I've actually spoken to a few people regarding that, and we are looking at putting a submission through for that as well. That is quite scary what's happening in that. I think we've slightly gone off topic. um, just to circle out your experience in legal aid, and then we'll get into the Maat's method stuff. What you were there for 3 years, 3.5 years. What sort of initiated the move from that legal aid position where you sort of doing the human rights looking at some of those human rights abuses, you're aware of the systems and processes that are in place to going out and starting your own business. What was the impetus that sort of to start that off?
there was some there were some aspects of the COVID response that we were sort of allowed to look at legal aid, and some aspects that we weren't. So I was doing work with
Right.
hotel quarantine stuff, false imprisonment. We were thinking, is there a way to bring false imprisonment in for the hotel quarantine? But even that, I felt a resistance towards. At the same time, early in 2020, I guess, I started doing work for individuals on the side. So people were beginning to be hit by particular kinds of restrictions. The public health orders began coming out, and people were reaching out to me for help in my personal life and also people that I didn't know, just because I'm a human rights lawyer. And I agreed with them that the things that were going on were human rights abuses. So I started to try to help them as much as I could. And at the same time, I started writing articles and posting them on the internet about what I thought. And one of those articles was about the public health orders not being lawful. So I made what was essentially an academic argument based on the Public Health Act and the public health orders to say that I didn't think that the public health orders were actually lawful. and that went viral. And that's when I started to get in trouble at work.
Yeah. I was going to say, how did that go down working for the government effectively?
Yeah, yeah, not very well.
Or having
So
government funding working?
yeah, not very well.
Yeah.
I started getting
That
pulled into
it
disciplinary meetings, and I started
right.
yeah, I started also having complaints made about me by members of the public, mostly for some reason academics. I don't know why, but some of these academics were furious that a young brown fellow was on the internet saying that the government was
Good.
making illegal public health orders. They were really angry and making complaints to the Law Society and to my employer. So my employer didn't like that either. And there was this accusation of going around that I was bringing the public service into disrepute. And I was like, hang on, that was an alarm bell moment for me because I thought, hang on, the public service, I'm literally trying to serve the public. So I started to get a bit annoyed, and I a little thing was going on inside me where I began to realize, shit, I'm gonna have to leave. Um, but I did. I stayed for a couple more months, and then
And what was that like? So you've got a secure job, you know, you've got a wife or a girlfriend at the time, and the you know the world's sort of crumbling in. You're trying to do the right thing. You're doing a public service. That's what your job is, and then everyone's attacking you. What's the stress that what's it like every day at work? Because this is the kind of challenges, and I'm not saying it's this extreme, but people will face these challenges day in day out. How do you stay true to your own values and then sort of progress through that, you know, while you're going through the meat grinder, if that makes sense?
yeah, um, it was scary. I had a wife at the time who was pregnant with our first child. We didn't have any savings.
Ah,
We,
right.
so it was definitely scary. To the credit of the individuals at Legal Aid, they were all respectful, and I didn't get because I've worked with many people who have been in this situation who have been absolutely abused, uh, teared through the mud, and treated like absolute, rubbish by their employer. I wasn't in that situation, but there was this weird boundary around what all of these people who were um, dialoguing with me were allowed to do and say. So they'd sort of make excuses and say, "Oh well, it's what are we supposed to do? Um, we're we're reliant on this, or we go to court in the local court, and to go there you have to have a vaccine or whatever." There was always a reason that stopped them, and I just realized, and they were asking me to compromise in a more strong and strong way as time went on, to the point where it was coming to a head. And I wasn't willing to compromise, and I was as honest as I could be with my supervisor, who I had a pretty good relationship with, and um, I don't think there's any resent there on the side. But I was very honest with him, but it wasn't up to him. It's up to the people above him, and it's up to the people above them. And ultimately, there's this bureaucracy that will only allow a relatively narrow type of person to continue, and that person is not somebody who oversteps the line in terms of what the organisation is.
Absolutely. And that time as well, like I remember it, like, you know, it was only 2 years ago, 3 years ago. It was a an era of fear. There was a lots of censorship happening on. I think some of your posts on LinkedIn got taken down as well. Some of the letters that you wrote as well got taken down on off LinkedIn as well. Um, and there was that era of fear. There was that whole don't question the narrative, don't question anything. Just asking why was kind of like a scary question, and especially when they were threatening people's income and their livelihoods. They were effectively saying, you know, yourself, you're doing your public service, but don't question any of this sort of stuff. Or you know, potentially, you know, you can't support your pregnant wife, and you know those sort of stresses that come out. It leads into something that you were saying earlier about, you know, human rights being funded by governments who are the biggest abusers of human rights. And the way that they go about that is there's always some sort of an emergency or some sort of, some emergency powers are required for right or wrong reasons. And that leads to effectively, these extra powers that just come out of the box somewhere that allow them to do things like, detain people without charge or, ban protesting or anything like that. I have a question for you about human rights specifically. My understanding is there is an international human rights charter that Australia does effectively, not directly, that we do sign up to. But those human rights charters specifically don't avert that issue, whereas there's always an exception to how you can bypass human rights, and it's always around that if there's an emergency, you can actually put all these stuff, in a box and don't worry about it, and you can sort of do what you can. Is that sort of the framework of human rights we have in the world, or is that just more of an Australia-centric thing?
Yeah. So prior to World War II, there wasn't really a global statement of what human rights were. There were various versions of that in various parts of the world. Um, and, and then before even that time where you had some kind of treaties and covenants in that form, there was older jurisprudence based on natural law. There were non-derogable principles that most human societies agreed with were important to uphold, that didn't have any exceptions to them. And were expressed in slightly different ways around the world by different cultures, but were essentially the same. Um, um, and they're everywhere. They're in religions as well. Like you've got the Ten Commandments in Christianity, you've got the 42 laws of Maat in ancient Egypt. But there's in more modern times, there's various conceptions of Greek and Roman law, for example, that incorporated human rights into it. After World War II, most of the governments of the world got together and decided, well, we can't have anything like that happen again. We're going to create a bunch of international treaties and covenants to try to ensure that governments around the world don't overstep particular lines when governing their citizens and acting in relation to each other as well. In those treaties and covenants, there had to be concessions made because it's very difficult to get 180 countries or whatever to agree to something. So as a result, there are lots of, and there's other reasons as well, but that's one of the reasons. There are lots of, as you mentioned, Raka, discretionary opt-out exceptions in the various human rights treaties and covenants. So Australia has signed up to the 7 major international treaties and covenants. There's the UN Declaration on Human Rights. There's the ICCPRs, 2 of the most significant of those. ICCPRs, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Both of those treaties, for example, include fundamental human rights within them, the same rights that have been enshrined for thousands of years, tens of thousands of years, hundreds of thousands of years potentially, in different forms. But they also, for the first time, in a significant way, implemented exceptions. So, yes, as you said, in situations of crisis, many of the rights are able to be derogated from by signatories, by countries who have signed up to them. But even with that said, there's another kind of opt-out, which is that they're international covenants and treaties without any real enforceability. Unless a country who has signed up to a treaty or a covenant chooses to ratify those rights in domestic law, there's limited obligations on the countries to actually do anything because there isn't any way to really force a country to uphold the human rights principles, absent going to war with them, which is a unique and complicated attempted solution to a problem like that. Although the United States has tried it several times. So back to your question, lots of exceptions in the treaties and covenants, and Australia hasn't enshrined many of those rights. We have a decent Privacy Act, Federal Privacy Act, and there are state and territory equivalents, so rights to privacy are relatively well enshrined in our domestic law. We have decent discrimination legislation, so if you've been discriminated against, there's at least local domestic avenues for restitution that you can follow that are statutorily enshrined. But beyond that and the implied right to freedom of political communication, which the High Court said exists in the shadows of our Constitution, we don't have explicit rights protections in the form of, say, a Bill of Rights or the Constitution that the United States has that actually enshrines several non-derogable human rights principles, meaning they can't be accepted from under any circumstances. We don't have anything like that. So Australia has a very poor human rights legal framework. One of the things we have, which is good, is we have the separation of powers between the courts and the government. So the courts are supposed to kind of pick up the slack by playing a very important role in ensuring that the government doesn't breach any of the laws or proper decision-making protocols that they're supposed to follow statutorily. But one of the issues with that is that the judiciary is still appointed by government in Australia, which I don't particularly like. I think that they should be totally independent in order to retain the separation of powers in as pure a way as possible. But nonetheless, that's one of the rights protection mechanisms that we have. So there are some mechanisms of protection of human rights that exist beyond the international covenants and treaties. But Australia, in general, rates pretty poorly in terms of our protection of those rights.
Right, that's really interesting, and a second question to that as well. In terms of, even though there is a separation of powers and there are the courts that are set up sort of to hold government to account to an extent, getting access to courts is not necessarily a cheap process, right? It's quite expensive for someone to, if there is a breach from a government and say a statutory body doesn't want to enforce that, there is the ability for citizens to actually go to the court and say, hang on a sec, my rights have been violated. But it's not necessarily accessible to everyone due to the high cost of actually doing that. Is that a fair statement?
Yeah, absolutely. It's inaccessible, I would say, to the large majority of the population, which is in itself a massive indictment on the legal system. Inaccessible because it's extremely costly, as you say. And not only does it cost a lot of money to go through the process, but if you lose, there's usually a costs risk, meaning you have to pay the legal costs for the other side, which they'll tell you about as soon as you file. But the other side, they'll say, hey, if you don't withdraw this right now, we're going to pursue you for costs to the nth degree. And they're going to hire top-tier law firm, multiple barristers, especially if it's a human rights issue. They're going to hire the best barristers to defend themselves. And the costs will be $100,000, $200,000. So not only is there a cost risk, there's also just the massive barrier in terms of the effort and the energy that's involved. Litigation is so taxing. It is not an accessible or easy system or process, especially if it concerns something personal to you, which often it does. It's extremely draining, onerous, difficult, trying to do it by yourself, especially if you don't have a lawyer who are very expensive. It's very, very, very difficult, and not many people can do it.
Absolutely. Look, I'm mindful that we're almost on the hour mark, so I will wrap this up soon. I do apologise. This has sort of gone ducktailed a little bit more than I expected to. Just a couple of questions. I would like to end on a bit of a positive note, and then we'll talk a little bit about Maat as well. So we're going into an era where there's going to be digital ID. There's going to be surveillance cameras everywhere. That we're going to an era we're going to have these things called 15-minute cities, and I think there are great possible applications for those things. You know, the speed of transactions. To be able to get something quickly, having everything close by, I think those are great things. But given the framework that we're in Australia necessarily, we may not have the protections in place to protect people's privacy or, you know, their ability to move. What do we do as a society to, you know, how do we get the ball rolling in getting those protections in place, not necessarily, you know, pulling back digital ID or, you know, getting rid of digital payments, which I think have great utility if they're not abused. But what is it? Where's the threshold that we need to sort of cross in order to get our protections in place so those things can't be used against us?
Even for areas of human rights that we have some statutory protections in place, such as this is a clear breach of the Federal Privacy Act. You're not allowed to do that. And that act exists. It hasn't stopped anybody. If I, as a lawyer, wanted to sue one of those organisations, I could. But what would really happen? We'd end up before the Office of the Australian Information Commissioner, which is a relatively weak forum in terms of actually holding organisations accountable. Um, they probably get a fine that won't really affect their bottom pocket, and they'll apologise and say, "Oh, sorry, we didn't know, we couldn't implement it." So um, beyond that, the way that I have seen, and I'll be optimistic after this slight pessimistic detour. The way that I have seen various arms of this society, be it the executive or the judiciary, apply the law over the past few years, um, lends me to believe that there isn't really any appetite amongst those systems or arms of society to protect what I'm referring to as human rights. There's other things going on. There are other priorities that are at play. However, be a little bit more optimistic. Where are human rights going to protections going to come from? From human beings. So when I refer to human rights, I'm a human rights lawyer in the sense that, yes, I work with the international treaties and covenants and the way that they are distilled into the Australian common law legal system. But I'm also a student of history, and I'm somebody who believes in upholding basic principles of what it means to be a human being. And that is why I was able to navigate the COVID period in the way that I was, because I have principles and values that underpin who I am, that go beyond the system that I live in. All of us do. We just have to kind of remember what they were. And that is happening on a societal level where we are having this conversation that we probably wouldn't have had 5 years ago, because we were both thinking about other things. There's conversations like this happening everywhere where people are starting to reprioritize and rebalance what's important to them. And it might be on a level where they're consciously thinking about the stuff I'm saying about authority, or it might just be very personal, where a lot of people are going back to trying to live a healthier lifestyle. They're going back to trying to live in more balance. They're going back to wanting community. A lot of people are very concerned about the way that technology is seemingly going to be used in the next few years. And I just don't think I think that the protections are already on their way because of the sort of awakening that's going on in society, where people are, and in Australia, where people have never had to think about a lot of people have never had to think about their rights before. They've sort of seen what's possible now, and that has awakened something. So I think that, to be honest, it's not going to come externally from out there. It's going to come internally from all of us, and I think it's already happening. Does that answer your question?
Absolutely, it does. It actually does. To me, that sounds like a societal shift, and maybe they pushed it a little bit too hard over the last couple of years, and now that we are changing, which is a sign of hope. Interesting about something you just mentioned as well. If we had this conversation 4 years ago about human rights, I'll be like, why do we need human rights lawyers in Australia?
Yeah.
It's Australia. We're the captain of human rights. You know, we're the champion of all human rights. I that great awakening you're talking about, I went through that. I learned about the pharmaceutical industry. Just about the pharmaceutical industry as well. If anyone wants to read a great book, it's called An Empire of Pain, and it's entirely about the OxyContin crisis in the US and how that effectively started the whole opioid crisis. I'm mindful we're over the hour mark, and I do try to limit these to an hour. So just my final questions will be, tell us a little bit about Maat's method. What is it you guys do? How do we help you out? I'm going to shoot you an email, and just if there's any way that we can maybe, do you have a donation page for projects that you're funding or anything like that? We'll put all the links at the bottom of this video. But do you want to give me, this is what I say to most entrepreneurs, give me your elevator pitch about everything that you do at the Maat method there.
Yeah, so Maat is the medic, which is another term for ancient Egyptian deity representing justice and balance. We've seen the scales of justice. That's a more modern interpretation. So Maat's method is about walking in truth, justice, and balance. Um, we started the business in the context of my wife and I both leaving our jobs that we had at the time because of what was going on, realizing that the only way we could really do what we wanted to do was to start our own business and taking a leap of faith and starting our own business, which then became a law firm. So I was lucky in the sense that, and one of the things that gave me courage to do that was that I already knew there was a lot of demand for human rights work because I was already doing it on the side, and I was overwhelmed. I was waking up in my final few months at Legal Aid. I would wake up at 2:30 a.m. in the morning, work on COVID-related cases that I was doing on the side until 7 a.m., do my job at Legal Aid, and then work more on the COVID stuff at night. So I was
Wow.
overwhelmed. I knew that people really needed help, um, and I decided that I would just help people instead of doing the job for someone else. So that's what it's been about since. And there's so much work because we're living in a time when people's human rights are being breached on a societal and individual scale. Um, you can follow our work if you're interested. We have platforms. We have a website, which is the best place to go, www.maatsmethod.com.au. You might put the links to Raka if you don't mind. And
Mhm.
you can subscribe to our newsletter there. We share a monthly newsletter where I update everybody on the work we're doing. We've been very lucky in the sense that um, we've been able to do, when I say we, it's my wife and I, we've been able to do work over the past couple of years that I would never have been able to do in private practice. Federal court cases, high court cases, historic cases
Wow.
that have been an attempt to try to resist the push that's been going on over the past few years, and that just seems to continue. And that has been a very liberating and challenging experience. But overall, the pleasure of autonomy overrides the discomfort of what is often very challenging work. That's my summary.
Now, question for you: is there any way that people can help out Mahat's method? Sorry, I did mispronounce it. I'm terrible with names. Do you have any cases or anything that is there? Do you have a GoFundMe or anything like that that people could or a Patreon or anything that we could support you with?
Not really, to be honest. We used to operate and still to some extent operate on a pay what you can basis. So um,
Yep.
we don't have a direct donation or Patreon facility or anything like that. If you want to support, I would say have a look at what we're doing and engage in some of the processes that we are trying to push. So if you go to our website or follow us on Instagram, Telegram, Facebook, I think they're the main three. And I'm also on LinkedIn as well, just under my name. Um, you'll see what we're up to, and you'll be able to support by becoming engaged. So, we're soon going to, I think actually by the time this comes out, we'll have a campaign for people to make submissions to the bill inquiry that Taraka was talking about, the misinformation bill. We're going to release our submission, which you can use to create your own submission and make a submission. And also just walking in the truth as much as possible, not compromising what you believe in. Being as honest as you can on a day-to-day basis and helping to facilitate the shift that we spoke of earlier, that would also be great.
That's amazing. And just on that, Bill, there will be a link at the bottom of this for anyone who wants to make a submission. And I do encourage everyone to write to their local member of parliament about that as well. The more eyeballs we get on that bill, the better the result could potentially be on that. So we'll definitely be watching out for everything that you're doing at Mahat's Method on that. And I'll be posting on even my socials about everything that you're doing on that. Peter, this has been a great interview. We have gone over time. I always go over time. I am so grateful for your time that you provided. Is there any final messages you'd like to say before we wrap this meeting up?
Oh, look, I'd just say thank you to you for having me. I appreciate the conversation. It's nice to meet you. It's a cool platform you got here, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Um,
Thank you.
what else would I say? If anything that I said, I mean, I don't know how people will respond to some of what I said, but um, if anything that I said is challenging or makes you feel despondent or depressed or pessimistic, I would just say, first of all, it's totally fine if we disagree. I'm very comfortable with disagreement, and that's part of a healthy society. Second of all, um, I think that things are actually looking up, and I think that we are in a process of transition, which is quite uncomfortable, but it's a necessary process that we have to go through in order to um, elevate individually and collectively as a society from a place that was actually quite dysfunctional before COVID began. We just didn't notice. So, yeah, I think things are looking up, and I just once again say thanks for having me.
Peter, no, thank you for coming on. I really do appreciate it. You've given some great information. We did ducktail the conversation a little bit away from career, but I think those topics that you covered were very important. And look, in the future, I'd love to have you back on. We'll definitely be following that stuff that you're doing with that legislation that's coming up. And we'll leave. I'll send you an email after this, and we'll just get all the links to all your socials and everything, and we'll put them at the bottom. And I think that's a great place to wrap this up. So thank you again for coming on, and I wish you the best of luck for everything that's going on at Maat and everything you do in the future.
Thank you, Taraka. Same to you. Thank you.
Cheers. Thank you. And and have a great day. Okay, guys, so I hope you got a lot of value out of that interview. Now, if you've got a job interview coming up or you're preparing for a job interview process, check out the link below. It's my free course on how to prepare for any job interviews. We go through the key things that knock people out all the time. Fashion and hygiene. What are the common questions you're likely to be asked? What questions do you need to prepare for? And critically, what do you do if you've started applying for jobs and you've got missed calls from recruiters? Now, those are screening calls and you have to pass those in order to get through the next stage. So if you want access to all of that, please check out the link below. Like always, best of luck with your career.